The great ballroom at Keldrith Hall had not been lit in 3 years, and it seemed to tremble now under the weight of so many candles, as though the house had forgotten how to hold light and was frightened of dropping it. Wren stood where a seamstress was meant to stand, in the shadow of the tall doors, half behind a marble pillar, close enough to be summoned and far enough to be forgotten. A torn flounce, a split seam, a lady swooning too near a hearth. These were the reasons she had been brought up from the sewing room and set at the edge of the dancing, a needle threaded and waiting in the folds of her plain gray skirt. She was not a gift. She was a repair kept close in case the evening frayed. She had spent the whole of that evening keeping her hands out of the light. They were gloved as every hand in the room was gloved, but hers were the wrong gloves, cheap cotton mended so many times that the darning had begun to darn itself, and along the left palm a seam had worn to a thread that would not hold much longer. All night she had turned that palm inward, curled it against her skirt, folded it beneath her arm. A servant's hands were permitted to be rough, but hers, if anyone looked closely, were the wrong kind of rough, and rough in the wrong places, and that was a thing she could not afford for anyone at Keldrith to see. She had meant only to watch for a moment. The music turned, and the room turned with it, and through the shifting colors, she saw the child again, the little girl on the gallery stairs, in a white nightgown she was not supposed to be wearing at such an hour, her small face pressed between the balusters. Ottilie, the Duke's daughter, who had not spoken a word since her mother was carried out of this house. That afternoon, the child had crept into the sewing room and stood watching Wren's needle go in and out, and Wren, without thinking, had cut a scrap of blue silk into the shape of a bird and folded its wings so they moved. The girl had held it all the rest of the day. She held it now. And because Wren was looking at the child, she did not see the Duke until the whole room had already gone quiet around him. Merrick, Duke of Keldrith, had not danced since he had buried his wife. Everyone in the county knew it. His aunt had raised this ball out of the ground for one purpose, to set a fresh, suitable young woman in his path and end his long retreat into grief, and all evening the room had waited for him to cross the floor to the girl she had chosen. He had not moved. Now, at last he moved. But he moved the wrong way. He walked past the waiting daughters of a dozen good houses, past his aunt's careful arrangement, past every gloved and gleaming hand held ready for him, and he stopped in front of the seamstress at the wall. He had seen her cut the bird. He had seen his silent daughter smile. "Will you dance?" he said. It was not quite a question. A duke's invitation never is. The room held its breath. Wren could not refuse him. No one could refuse him. And so she did the only thing left to her. She gave him her hand. His fingers closed over hers, and she felt the worn seam give. It parted along her palm with a small soundless surrender, and where the cotton opened, the truth of her hand lay bare against his. Not a lady's hand, not even an honest servant's, but a hand marked by a craft no maid was ever taught. The pale gloss of an old burn across the base of the thumb, the flattened callus where a graver is pressed. Dot fingertips stained faintly, ineradicably, with the rouge that polishes gold. She felt him feel it. She felt the exact instant he understood that the hand in his was hiding something. He looked down. So did she. For one endless breath, the two of them stared at the tear in her glove, as if it were a wound that had opened in the middle of the floor. And then, into that silence, Lady Verena's voice arrived like a dropped blade. "Merrick, sweet." Carrying, meant for every ear in the room. "Whatever are you doing with the help?" Wren pulled her hand free. She should not have. One does not withdraw from a duke. One waits to be released. But instinct is older than manners, and every instinct she owned was screaming that the torn glove had shown too much to the one man in England who must never look at her closely. She stepped back into the shadow of the pillar, dropped a curtsy so deep it was nearly a collapse, and murmured something about a Hem? A summons, a lady in need, and then she was gone. Out through the servant's door into the cold stone corridor where the music thinned to a rumor, and her heart could hammer without an audience. Behind her, she heard laughter begin, thin and cruel. The laughter Lady Verena had unstoppered on purpose. She did not hear the Duke laugh. She did not hear him speak at all. That silence would trouble her later, when she had leisure to be troubled. For now there was only the corridor and her ruined glove, and the certainty that she had made a terrible mistake. To understand the mistake, one must go back 3 weeks to the morning Wren first came to Caldreth Hall. She had come with a forged letter of character and a needle case that was genuinely, honestly hers, and she had been taken on because the house was short of hands before the ball, and because she asked for less than she was worth. She kept to the sewing room. She learned the passages in the pantries, the hours the family kept, the tempers of the upper servants. She made herself into what the house wanted a seamstress to be: quiet, quick, and invisible. Invisibility was the whole of her plan. She had not counted on the child. Ottilie found her on the 3rd day. The little girl walked into the sewing room without a sound. She did everything without a sound now, and stood in the doorway with her thumb in her mouth, watching. Wren said good morning and received no answer and thought nothing of it. Children were strange, and this one had reason to be. But the next morning the child came again, and the next, until it became a settled thing between them. Unspoken because one of them could not speak, the girl would sit on the low stool by the window, and Wren would sew. And now and then, Wren would talk, not asking anything, never asking, only murmuring about the weather or the color of a thread, or the sparrow that had built badly in the eave. Ottilie never answered, but she came. Every day, she came. It did not stop there. In the walled garden, when Wren was sent to fetch lavender for the linen presses, the child appeared between the hedges and slipped a small cold hand into hers, and would not let go. And the two of them walked the gravel paths in silence until a nursemaid came running, white-faced, to carry her off. In the long window seat of the west landing, where Wren mended by the last of the daylight, Ottilie learned to find her, curling into the cushions with the blue silk bird, and watching the needle, as though it were the only moving thing in a house that had stopped. She did not smile for anyone else. She did not go to anyone else. She had a father who loved her and a great-aunt who managed her and a nursery full of dolls she never touched, and she chose the sewing woman. "She's the Duke's daughter, not your pet," the head housekeeper said, in the flat voice servants use for warnings. "Lady Verena has noticed. See that she stops noticing." And another maid, kinder or only more frightened, took Wren aside by the still-room and whispered that it wasn't natural, the way the poor mute mite trailed after a stranger, that some of the older servants had begun to cross themselves over it, muttering that the child was fey. That grief had opened something in her that fixed on strangers, that there'd been talk, and that talk in this house had a way of reaching her ladyship, and her ladyship had a way of turning talk into dismissals. Wren had thanked her and meant to obey. She always meant to obey. Her whole purpose depended on drawing not one eye more than she must. But how do you turn away a child who asks for nothing except to sit near you while you work? She could not do it. That was her flaw. And she knew it was a flaw. And she had known it since the first afternoon the girl fell asleep against her knee, with the blue silk bird clutched in one fist. A woman on a secret errand had no business being the one warm thing in a cold house. Yet every day the child came, and every day Wren let her stay, and somewhere above them, unseen, a grieving father had begun to notice that his daughter, who had not smiled since her mother died, smiled in the sewing room. That was why he had crossed the ballroom. Wren understood it now. Standing alone in the corridor with her torn glove pressed against her chest, he had not chosen her. He had followed the only thread of warmth left in his house, and it had led him to her hand, and her hand had betrayed her. A door opened, somewhere behind her. Slow footsteps, a tread too heavy and too certain to be a servant's. Wren did not turn around. She did not need to. She already knew the way a hunted thing knows that the Duke of Caldreth had left his own ball to follow her into the dark. Her name was not Wren. Wren was a small brown thing that no one looked at twice, and that was precisely why she had chosen it. Her name was Elspeth Caro, and she had not come to Caldreth Hall to sew. 2 years before, she had been the daughter of a house of her own, not a grand one, but a good one, warm with firelight and the smell of hot metal, above the finest goldsmith's workshop in the city of Harlow. Ambrose Caro could coax a living face out of a locket the size of a thumbnail. King's factors came to his door, and because he trusted the world as an honest man trusts it, he taught his motherless daughter everything he knew: the graver and the burnisher, the reek of the acids, the patient trick of setting a stone so it holds light like water. Those were the lessons written into her hands. Those were the marks the torn glove had shown the Duke. Her father's ruin had a name, and the name was Silas Corvain. Corvain was an appraiser and a rival, a smiling man with soft hands who had never made a beautiful thing in his life, but knew exactly what beautiful things were worth. For years he had watched the great houses pass over his own middling shop and carry their gold to Ambrose Caro instead, and he had smiled through all of it and waited. When the old Duke of Caldreth, the present Duke's father, commissioned a great collar of gold and sapphire as a gift, it was Ambrose Caro who made it, and Silas Corvain who was asked to value it. That was the mistake that undid them all. Putting the piece into the hands of the one man who wanted its maker destroyed, Corvain did his work quietly, cleverly, over the course of a single season. He, let it be known, never openly, only in the right ears, over the right glasses of wine, that the master goldsmith had cheated his noble patron, that real stones had been swapped for cut glass, that the gold beneath the surface ran thin and base, that the celebrated Ambrose Caro was, and perhaps had always been, a fraud. He produced figures. He produced a second appraisal, his own, sworn and stamped. He was believed because he was respectable, and because a lie about a craftsman is always easier to believe than the craftsman's whole honest life. It was a lie built stone by stone, and it held. The commission was seized, the workshop was seized, the tools sold off the bench while her father stood and watched. The good name that had taken 30 years to make was gone in 3 months, and Ambrose Caro, who had never in his life owed a penny he did not pay, was carried off for debts that Corvain's slander had conjured out of nothing, and died in a debtor's cell one gray morning, with his daughter's hand in his, and his innocence unproven on his lips. "Bind the drawings, Elspeth," he had told her. At the end, when the fever made him lucid and cruel with hope, "I sent them somewhere safe. I sent them to a good man." He never finished the name. Elspeth had buried him with borrowed money and had gone out into a world that had decided she was the daughter of a thief. She might have vanished entirely, many do, had a letter not found her in her second winter of destitution. It came from her father's oldest journeyman, a half-blind old craftsman named Jory Pell, who had believed in Ambrose to the end. He remembered something the courts had never heard. That, in the weeks before the accusation, fearing exactly the treachery that came, her father had sent certain things to the old Duke of Caldreth for safekeeping: his working drawings, his assay notes, the honest record in his own hand that would prove the collar was true and Corvain's word was false. Old Duke had died soon after, and the papers had never surfaced, and everyone had forgotten they existed, everyone but Jory Pell. And there was one thing more, the thing that had turned a wild hope into a resolve of iron. Silas Corvain had a sister. She had married upward, into the family that had bought her brother's slanders and never known them for slanders. She kept a great house now, and ran its society, and stood at the top of its stairs like a queen. Her name was Lady Verena Ashmole, and she lived at Caldreth Hall. So Elspeth Caro had become Wren the seamstress, and walked in through the servants' door of the very house that held both her proof and her enemy into her enemy's own family, under her enemy's own roof, close enough to touch the woman whose brother had killed her father. It was the boldest thing she had ever done, and she suspected the most foolish. If Lady Verena had ever glimpsed the truth, she would have had her thrown into the road at best and handed to a magistrate at worst, for the daughter of a convicted fraud was a marked woman, and a marked woman found living under a false name in a great house is not given the benefit of any doubt. But the drawings had come to Caldreth. Of that Jory Pell was sure. And if they were anywhere, they were where the old Duke had kept the things he valued: his study, his cabinets, the locked rooms of a locked man. And those were rooms a seamstress had no reason to enter and no right to search. For 3 weeks, she had learned the house instead. She had memorized which doors were kept locked and which keys hung where, which servants could be asked an idle question and which could not, which hours the family left the old wing empty. She had searched where a sewing woman could search and found nothing, and told herself she had time. She did not have time. She had a torn glove, a Duke who had felt the truth in her palm, and coming toward her down a dark corridor, the slow footsteps of the one man in the house, with the power to strip away every layer of her disguise at once. If he asked who she was, she could lie. She had lied to everyone. But she had a cold, sinking certainty, standing there with her heart in her mouth, that the Duke of Caldreth had already stopped believing her name, and a far colder fear beneath it, one she had never let herself look at directly, that the proof she had come to find might not clear her father at all, that the honest papers had gone to the old Duke and never come out again, and that the reason no one had ever seen them since might be that the old Duke, Merrick's own beloved, honored father, had been the one to bury them. The footsteps stopped. A shadow fell across the flagstones at her feet. "Turn around," said the Duke of Caldreth, "and tell me your name." He had not decided to follow her. That was the thing Merrick would turn over afterward, in the long hours he no longer spent sleeping, that his feet had carried him out of his own ballroom, and down the servants' passage, before his mind had any say in it, drawn after a gray skirt the way iron is drawn to a lodestone, without consent, without dignity, without the least idea what he meant to do when he caught her. "Turn around," he said, "and tell me your name." She turned. He had braced for tears, or for the cringing, flattering fear that servants wore around him like a second uniform, and he got neither. She stood very straight in the cold light of the single wall sconce, her ruined glove pressed against her, and she looked at him, not up at him, the way people looked at a duke, but at him, level and steady, as if she were the one taking a measure. "Ren your grace," she said, "I sew for the household. I was sent up in case a gown wanted mending, and I stepped too far into the room, and I am very sorry for it." Every word of it was smooth, plausible, exactly what a frightened seamstress ought to say. He did not believe a syllable. He looked at her hand. She saw him look and did not hide it. Now, there was no point. He had already felt it, and in the yellow light he saw again what he had felt against his palm on the floor above. The old burn, the polished callus, the faint stain worked so deep into the skin that no soap would ever lift it. Working hands, but not a laundress's hands, not a scullion's. Something finer and stranger, hands that had been taught a trade of great delicacy and then made to scrub. And her voice. He had spent his life among people bred to speak well, and this woman, this seamstress, shaped her words like one of them. A craftsman's hands, a lady's tongue, a nobody's name. 3 things that did not belong to the same person. He had built a life on the reading of such things. A duke who ran his own lands learned quickly to tell the honest steward from the thief, the true account from the doctored one, the man who met his eye from the man who studied his boots. And every instinct that had kept Caldreth solvent through 3 hard years was telling him now that the woman in front of him was a forgery in reverse, not a servant, dressed above her station, but something finer folded down small and hidden inside gray wool. He could have pressed her. He could have summoned the housekeeper, and had her references pulled apart thread by thread until the lie showed. A week ago he would have. Tonight, looking at the steadiness in her face, he found he did not want to be the third person that day to take something from her. "You may go," he heard himself say. She dropped a curtsy and went, and he stood in the empty passage for a long time after the last whisper of her skirt had faded, feeling something he had not felt in so long that he almost failed to recognize it. Curiosity. The plain, living pull of wanting to know a thing. For 3 years, Merrick, Duke of Culdreth, had known only one feeling, and had mistaken its steadiness for strength. When Aveline died, when the fever took her and the small blue sun she had died to bring into the world, both of them gone in a single gray dawn, he had closed the ballroom and dismissed the musicians, and folded himself into the running of the estate as a man folds himself into deep cold water, because work did not ask anything of the heart. He had told himself he was enduring. His aunt had told the county he was grieving. His daughter had simply stopped speaking, and no physician in 3 counties could say why, and he had learned to live beside her silence, as beside a locked door to which he had lost the key. He had crossed the ballroom tonight for one reason only. He had seen from the far side of the room his daughter smile. He had followed that smile down to its source, and its source was the woman at the wall with the paper bird, and he had reached for her hand because some starved animal part of him wanted to stand for one moment inside the warmth his child had found. That was all. He had not meant to uncover anything, but he had, and now he could not put it back. He climbed to the nursery instead of returning to his guests. Audley was asleep, the scrap of blue silk still folded in her fist, and Merrick stood over her small bed and made a decision that he told himself was practical and knew, even as he made it, was nothing of the kind. In the morning, the seamstress would be taken off her needle and set to attend his daughter. He would have the mystery where he could see it. He would keep the one warm thing in his cold house close. It did not once occur to him it would not, until it was very nearly too late, that by drawing her into the light he had just painted a target on her back for the one person in the house who missed nothing and forgave less. Lady Verena Ashmole did not rage when she heard. Rage was for women with no better instrument, and Verena had spent 30 years learning the finer ones. She could not undo the Duke's order. Even she could not openly overrule Merrick under his own roof, and so she did not try. She simply saw to it that being chosen was made into a punishment. If the seamstress was to wait upon Audley, then the seamstress would also carry the nursery coals up 4 flights before dawn, and beat the nursery rugs in the wet of the courtyard, and sit up past midnight with mending that no one needed by morning, and take her meals alone after the others had finished. When the kitchen fire was dead and the food was cold, none of it could be called cruelty. Every task had a reason. That was Verena's art. She built a cage of perfectly reasonable bars, and invited you to complain of any single one of them, so that you would look like a shirker and a liar if you did. The other servants understood the game at once and played their parts, because a household takes its weather from the top, and the weather had turned. Conversation stopped when Wren entered a room. Small kindnesses dried up. A girl who had shared bread with her a week before now looked through her as through a window. It was a campaign of cold, waged patiently, designed to make her so wretched that she would pack her box and vanish of her own accord and leave her ladyship's world tidy again. Wren bore it the way she had learned to bear everything since her father died, without a word, without a tear, giving the enemy nothing to feed on. She rose before the coals wanted carrying. She beat the rugs until her arms shook and her breath smoked in the yard, and she did not once complain. She had discovered long ago that composure was the single possession no one could confiscate, and that it maddened cruel people more than any defiance because there was nothing in it to punish. Let them watch her. Let them find her dull. Every hour they spent being satisfied that she was breaking was an hour they were not asking who she really was. There was one warmth left to her, and it was the one that had put her in danger to begin with. Whatever chores Verena piled on, The hours in the nursery were still hers, and the child still came to her, climbing into her lap without a sound, pressing the worn blue bird into her hands to be mended when its wing came loose, falling asleep against her shoulder while the winter dark pressed on the windows. Wren knew she ought to have been cold with the girl, to starve the attachment that had drawn every eye in the house upon her. She could not do it. There are people who cannot be unkind to save themselves, and she had long ago stopped pretending she was not one of them. She would hold the sleeping child and feel her own resolve steady, and think, "Whatever they do to me, I will not become one of them. That is the whole of it. That is the only victory they cannot take." But composure does not stop a clock, and the cost of Verina's slow knife was not the aching arms or the cold suppers. It was time. She was watched, now every hour of the day, and a watched woman cannot search a house. The old Duke's study, the locked room in the west wing where a careful man had kept the things he valued. The one room in all of Caldrith she had crossed an ocean of risk to reach, stood as far out of her grasp as it had the day she arrived. She had not so much as set her hand to its door. Every plan she had made in her second winter of grief. Every night she had lain awake, rehearsing how she would slip in and search the cabinets and slip out again. A vindicated woman had assumed one thing above all, that she would have time and quiet. Verina had taken all three, and done it so reasonably that Wren could not even hate her cleanly for it. And then, on a gray morning at the end of that first terrible week, standing in the still room with the cold creeping through her boots, she heard the thing that turned her slow dread into something with a countdown. Two housemates were talking, and did not trouble to lower their voices for her. Her ladyship, they said, had made her arrangements at last. The old Duke's rooms were to be cleared, and the whole of the family's plate and jewels valued for the settlement of some debt of the estate. A gentleman was coming from the city to do the appraising, a very respectable gentleman, her ladyship's own brother, who had done such work for the family before and could be trusted to be discreet. He would arrive at Caldrith in 2 days. Wren stood with a jar of dried lavender going slowly to dust in her hands, and the still room seemed to tilt around her 2 days. She had crossed half a country and buried her pride and her name to reach one locked room, and now the door was to be thrown open at last, but not for her, for him. If her father's drawings lay behind that lock, then the first hands to touch them in 2 years would be the very hands that had signed him into a debtor's grave, and Silas Corvain would know exactly what they were and exactly what to do with a fistful of papers that could hang him. A candle and a grate. It would take him less than a minute. 2 years of proof, gone in the time it took a log to catch. She set the jar down before her shaking hands could drop it. She had told herself for a week that she still had time. She had none. In 2 days, the man who had murdered her father with a lie would walk back into this house, and either she found the drawings before he did, or her father would stay a thief in the world's memory forever, and she would have thrown her whole life away for nothing. His name was Silas Corvain, and he was coming home to finish what he had started. The summons came the next afternoon, and it frightened Wren more than any of Verina's cold cruelties had, because it came from a quarter she could not read. The Dowager Duchess, Merrick's grandmother Honoria, kept her own apartments in the East Wing, and did not, as a rule, trouble herself with the running of the house. She was very old and very sharp, a small, upright woman with a face like a folded map, and eyes that had watched 3 generations of her family make the same mistakes. She had come to Caldrith for the ball and stayed, and the servants were more careful around her than around Lady Verina, because Verina's anger was at least a thing you could predict, and the Dowager's attention was not. Wren was shown in and left standing on the carpet. The old woman looked at her for a long time without speaking, and Wren kept her eyes lowered and her hands folded and waited, as she had waited out 100 other examinations, giving nothing. A clock ticked on the mantel. Somewhere below, faintly, the house went about its business, and Wren counted her own breaths and told herself that an old woman's curiosity was survivable, that she had survived worse, that all she had to do was be dull enough for long enough, and she would be dismissed back to her coals and her mending. "You have very quiet manners," the dowager said at last. "Too quiet. A true servant fidgets. She is always half afraid, and it shows in the hands. You are afraid, I think, but it does not show anywhere at all. That is not a servant's fear. That is the fear of someone who has learned that showing it costs too much." She tilted her head. "Where did you learn a thing like that, child, at your age?" "I don't take your meaning, Your Grace," Wren said. "No." "I don't suppose you'll admit that you do." The old woman almost smiled. "Come here to the window. My eyes are old. I like to see a person in good light." There was no refusing it. Wren crossed to the window, and the pitiless afternoon sun fell full on her, and the dowager reached out with one ringed, papery hand and took Wren's own, turned it over, before Wren could think to resist, and studied the palm the way a jeweler studies a stone. Wren's pulse slammed. Every instinct in her screamed to pull free, and she held still by main force, because pulling free would say more than the hand ever could. "They dress you in gray and set you to beating rugs," the old woman murmured, tracing the callus, the burn, the ineradicable stain. "And my daughter-in-law watches you like a cat at a mouse-hole. And my grandson has not looked at a living woman in 3 years and now cannot stop looking at you. A house full of clever people, and not one of them has troubled to read what is written right here in your hand." She looked up, and her old eyes were bright and terrible with intelligence. "But I have spent 70 years watching people pretend to be what they are not. And I will tell you what I have learned. The world weighs a person the way an appraiser weighs metal, by what it can get for them, what they cost, what they fetch. It has no scale at all for what a person is worth, which is a different thing entirely, and can only be seen by someone who is not trying to buy or sell." "Your Grace is kind to a sewing woman," Wren said carefully, "but I think you see a great deal more in me than is there. I think I see precisely what is there, and that it terrifies you that I do." A brisk step sounded in the corridor outside, the unmistakable decided tread of Lady Verena, coming this way, and Wren felt the blood leave her face. If Verena came in now, and found the dowager holding the seamstress's bare hand in the light, studying it, talking to her as an equal, the game was over. Her ladyship missed nothing and forgave less, and she would want to know at once what an old woman found so interesting in a servant's palm. The footsteps slowed at the door. Wren's heart stopped. They went past. A door further down the corridor opened and closed. Wren realized she had not breathed, and made herself breathe. The dowager had watched all of it, the panic, the frozen stillness, the slow return of color, with the mild, merciless interest of a woman confirming a diagnosis. "You see," she said quietly. A true servant would have been glad of the interruption. "You were afraid of it. You have a great deal to lose in this house, child, and none of it is a place as a seamstress." She released Wren's hand and settled back, and for a moment she was only a tired old woman in a chair. "You need not fear me, whatever you decide to believe. I have buried a husband and a son, and watched a granddaughter-in-law die in her bed too young, and I have no appetite left for helping the strong crush the friendless. That has never been justice. It has only ever been the strong getting their way and calling it order." Her voice dropped. "But I did not summon you to be kind. I summoned you because I remember something, and old women who remember things are dangerous to people who would rather the past stayed buried." She was silent a moment, her gaze gone far away. "I saw a great collar once," she went on, as if remarking on the weather. "Gold and sapphire made for my late son to give away. The finest work I ever laid eyes on. And then a very respectable little man stood up and swore it was a cheat, and a fraud, and paste, and the whole world that had praised it a month before turned round and agreed, because it is always easier to believe a maker is a liar than to believe he is a genius. They said the goldsmith cheated. I never believed it. I had held the thing in my 2 hands. There was no lie in it anywhere. The only lie in the whole affair stood in the appraiser's soft, clean fingers. She had not truly let Wren go. Now she leaned forward and caught her wrist again, gentle and inescapable. "His name was Ambrose Caro," she said. "And unless these old eyes have finally failed me, child, so is yours." For a long moment, Wren did not answer, because there was no answer that did not end her. To deny it was useless. The old woman had read her hand like a page. To confirm it was to hand her whole life to a stranger. So she stood in the merciless window light and said nothing at all, and let the silence be her answer, and waited to learn what this sharp old creature meant to do with her. Honoria studied her, and then, astonishingly, she smiled. A small, fierce, satisfied smile. The smile of a woman who has waited a long time to be proven right about something. "You needn't look at me as though I were the executioner, child. I have no love for my daughter-in-law and none at all for her brother, and I have carried the memory of that ruined man for 2 years like a stone in my shoe. I could not prove a thing. I am an old woman, and old women are not believed. But you are his daughter, and you have his eye in his hands, and you did not cross a country and bury your name to sit in my window and weep." Her voice sharpened to a point. "You came for the proof. So let us not waste the little time we have. You know, I think that they mean to open your father's grave tomorrow, in a manner of speaking. Silas Corvain arrives to appraise this family's jewels, and my grandson's study, my late son's study, where a careful man kept his papers under lock, is to be opened and cleared for the occasion." "I know it," Wren whispered. It was the first true thing she had said aloud in 3 weeks, and it cost her. "Then you know that whatever is in that room, if you do not find it before he does, you will never find it at all." Unquote. The dowager reached into the work-basket beside her chair and drew out a small iron key, worn bright with age, and pressed it into Wren's palm. "My son gave me this the year before he died, to keep against his absent-mindedness. He never asked for it back. I have wondered these 2 years why I never returned it to the steward. Now I know. Tonight the house sleeps early. I have seen to a great deal of wine at supper. The old wing will be empty. What you do with an hour and a key is your affair, but be quick and be quiet, and if you are caught, you never had this from me." Wren closed her fingers around the key. It was warm from the old woman's hand. "Why?" she managed. "Why help me at all? I am nothing to you." The dowager regarded her for a moment, and when she answered, her voice had lost its edge. "Because I am very old, child, and I have spent a great deal of my life being agreeable to people I despised and holding my tongue while the strong arranged the world to suit themselves and called it the natural order. I have not much time left to be brave in. I find I should like to spend a little of it on the right side of something. For once." She waved a hand, suddenly brisk again, dismissing the sentiment before it could settle. "Now go, and stop looking at me as though I had given you the moon. I have given you an hour and a rusty key. What you make of them is entirely your own affair. If the story has its hold on you, take a moment to subscribe. It costs you nothing and helps these tales find the people who need them. Stay close. Now everything Wren has risked is about to be decided in the dark. We'll be back in a moment." The house did sleep early. Wren lay in her narrow bed in her clothes, listening to Caldreth settle around her, the creak of timbers giving up the day's warmth, the last footsteps on the back stairs, the deep silence that finally came down like snow. When the tall clock below had struck 1, she rose, took her unlit candle in her tinderbox and the small iron key, and went out into the dark. She had learned the house well in 3 weeks. She went down by the servants' stair, and along the stone passage where no rushlight burned, one hand on the cold wall, her heart going like a hammer on an anvil. The great house at night was a different country. The moonlight came gray through the tall windows, and lay in long bars across the floor, and every portrait she passed seemed to turn its painted eyes to mark her going by. Twice she froze at a sound, a shudder working in the wind, the settling groan of an old beam, and stood with her back flat to the paneling, until her heartbeat came down out of her ears. Once she heard, or thought she heard, a soft tread on the floor above, and waited an eternity in the dark before she dared move again. She did not light the candle until she had eased open the study door and shut it soundlessly behind her. The old Duke's study smelled of cold ash and older paper, and a ghost of pipe smoke that 2 years had not scoured away. She struck her light. The little flame swelled and steadied, and the room came up out of the dark. A great desk, walls of cabinets, a cold hearth, everything shrouded in the fine gray dust of a room no one entered. She set to work at once, and here at last her disguise fell away, and her true self did the labor. For she searched the way her father had taught her to build, methodically, patiently, reading the furniture the way he had read a rough stone for the line along which it would cleave. She knew what she was looking for because she knew her father's mind. Ambrose Caro trusted no hiding place he had not made himself, and he had a fondness for the false bottom, the drawer behind the drawer, the panel that gave to a fingernail in the right seam. As a girl, she had watched him fit such things for wealthy clients who feared their own households, laughing softly at the cleverness of it, never dreaming she would one day be on her knees in a dead man's study putting that knowledge to the only use that had ever mattered. If he had sent his proof here, and if a careful patron had truly meant to keep it safe, it would be somewhere a servant, clearing a room would never think to knock. She ran her fingers along the underside of every drawer. She pressed the carved rosettes of the desk one by one. She tilted her candle to read the grain of the wood for the telltale seam, where 2 pieces met that ought to have been one. She was quick and she was silent, and the minutes bled away like blood from a wound, and she found nothing, and all the while some animal part of her strained at the door, certain that at any moment it would open. And then, in the deep bottom drawer of the desk, beneath a false floor of cedar that answered her fingernail exactly as her father's work always did, she found not the drawings, but a slim ledger and a folded paper tucked into its spine. Her hands shook as she opened it to the light. It was a private register, in a cramped ducal hand, and near the last used page, dated in the very season of her father's ruin, she read the entry that stopped her breath. Recti of A. Caro, sealed, for keeping. The working papers as he fears interference to be held in the strong room until the matter is put right. Put right. The old Duke had known. He had received her father's proof and set it aside, and written until the matter is put right, and then had done nothing, and the matter had never been put right, and her father had died. The papers were not here. They were in the strong room, behind a door no key of hers would ever open. She pressed the ledger to her chest and shut her eyes, dizzy with grief and fury and a terrible dawning question about the man who had written those 3 cold words. Behind her, the study door opened. Light fell across the floor. A second candle, held high, and a low voice, taut with disbelief, said into the dark, "You are in my father's rooms, at 2 in the morning with his key." A pause, and then, quieter and far more dangerous, "Put down whatever you are holding and turn around, and this time do not lie to me." She turned. The Duke of Caldra stood in the doorway in his shirt-sleeves, a branch of candles in his hand, and his face in the upward light was terrible, not with rage, she saw, but with something worse, a kind of grieved certainty, as though he had come down expecting to have his worst suspicion confirmed and hated being right. His eyes went from her face to the ledger clutched against her, to the open drawer, the picked secret of his dead father's desk laid bare. "I trusted you near my child," he said. "I took you off your needle. I stood in front of my whole house and gave you my hand. And you repay me by robbing the dead." His voice did not rise. "That was the worst of it. Whatever you have taken, I could see you hanged for it. Do you understand that? Give me one reason I should not call the house awake this instant. And Wren, who had lied to everyone for 2 years, who had a dozen smooth falsehoods ready on her tongue, found that she was done with them. She was tired, in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. She looked at this grieving, upright wronged man, and she thought, let it end here then, but let it end with the truth. Because I have taken nothing that is yours, she said, and her voice was steady and clear, and nothing at all like a servant's. This ledger is your father's, and I will set it down, and you may read it yourself. But first hear me, your grace, since I shall not have another chance to be heard. I did not come to Caldrith to sow, and my name is not Wren. She lifted her chin. My name is Elspeth Caro. My father was Ambrose Caro, the finest goldsmith in the kingdom, and he was called a cheat and a fraud by a man who could not have told a true sapphire from a lump of blue glass, and he died of it in a debtor's cell with my hand in his and his good name in ruins. And this, she held up her scarred, stained palm, the hand the torn glove had shown him. This is the hand of a goldsmith's daughter, who was taught the trade at his bench, and who has spent 2 years learning that the world would rather believe a maker is a liar than admit it was fooled by one. The candles trembled in the Duke's hand. Prove it, he said. But it was not the challenge of a moment before. It was something nearer a plea. So she proved it. She crossed to the cold hearth where a small tarnished box of the old Duke's oddments sat, opened it, and by candlelight named each thing in it as her father would have. This, a paste brilliant, worth nothing, and this beside it a true old-cut diamond, and here the difference between them written in the way, each through the flame. And here a seal ring whose gold was base beneath a wash, and would answer to acid, though it fooled the eye. She turned each piece to the light, with the sure, unhurried fingers of someone who had done it 10,000 times, and she spoke the language of the bench, the true grammar of stones and metal that no lady learns and no servant needs, the water of a stone, the fire, the way a real sapphire drinks the candle and a false one only throws it back. She had not spoken that language aloud in 2 years. It came out of her like something released, and she watched the last of his disbelief go out of him like a snuffed wick. He set the candles down because his hand was no longer steady enough to hold them. There was a collar, he said hoarsely. Sapphires. My grandmother speaks of it still. They said it was false. They took it into the vault, and it has sat there as a worthless thing for— He stopped. For 2 years. They said my father made it false, Elspeth said. He did not. He never made a false thing in his life. It was the one thing he could not do, the way some men cannot carry a tune. The proof of it is his own working papers, in his own hand, with the weight and water and source of every stone set down, and by that ledger you may read for yourself, your grace. Those papers came here, to your father, for safekeeping. She held it out to him. Her voice did not shake, but her hand did. A little, at the end. I only wanted to clear his name. That is all I have ever wanted. Not his money, not his house. They are gone, and I have made my peace with it. Only his name. I will go to the magistrate with you now, tonight, if you wish it, and take whatever comes. But I will not stand in this room and let you believe I am a thief, when the only thief in this whole miserable business has been dead these 2 years, respected and rich. He did not take the ledger. He looked at her for a long, long moment. This woman he had pulled into the light on a whim and nearly had hanged, and Elspeth watched a wall come down behind his eyes that she suspected had stood there since the morning his wife died. When he spoke again, the anger was wholly gone from him, and what stood in its place was something raw and far more frightening to her, because she did not know how to defend against it. Shame. I stood at that window, he said slowly, the night of the ball, and I watched my aunt pile cruelties on a seamstress. And I told myself it was the running of a household and no concern of mine. I have told myself that about a great many things these 3 years. It was easier to grieve than to look. He drew a breath. You have been under my roof, wronged in danger, doing the bravest thing I have ever heard of, and I gave you coals to carry. No, he said at last very low, before she could find any answer to that. You will not go to any magistrate. You will go back to your room, and you will say nothing to anyone, and you will let no one, see that you are anything but a seamstress. Do you understand me? Corvain comes tomorrow. His jaw tightened. Leave the ledger. Leave all of it to me. I will read what my father wrote, and I will find those papers if they are in this house. And heaven help me, Miss Caro. If what you say is true, then this family owes you a debt that I mean to see paid in full, whatever the paying of it costs the name of Caldrith. Merrick did not sleep. He read the ledger through 3 times by a guttering candle, and each reading was worse than the last, because each reading made it plainer that the cramped hand he had loved and honored all his life had written until a matter is put right, and then let the matter rot. He was a methodical man, and grief had made him a patient one, and he turned that patience now upon his own house. Before the servants stirred, he was in the muniment room with the steward's master keys, and he opened the strong room that no one had troubled in 2 years, and he began to search it as his father's son had every right to search. No creeping, no candle in the dark, only a duke going through his own family's papers in the gray of the morning. He worked for hours, coat off, sleeves back, kneeling among the deed boxes on the cold stone floor. He found the deeds and the settlements and the dull machinery of a great estate, the marriage articles and the tenancy rolls and a lifetime of a careful family's paper. And then in an iron box at the back, behind the ledgers, no one ever opened, wrapped in oiled cloth and sealed with his father's own signet, he found a packet that had plainly not been touched since the day it was closed. He weighed it in his hand and did not open it. Not yet. He found, to his own surprise, that he was afraid to, that some part of him already knew what it would say, and knew that once he had read it, he could never again be a man who had not read it. He locked it away again and pocketed the key, and went up to face the day. Downstairs, Caldreth was making itself ready to receive its guest, and Merrick moved through the preparations like a man walking in his sleep, watching his aunt with new eyes. Lady Verena was everywhere that morning, brisk and gracious, ordering the best rooms aired, the plate brought up, the jewels fetched from the vault and laid out on green baize for her brother's expert eye. She was so pleased. She stopped him in the gallery to say what a comfort it was that he was taking an interest in the family's affairs again, that his dear father would have been glad to see him stir himself, and Merrick stood and let her say it, and thought that he had never in his life understood so completely what it meant to want to be sick. She had no notion that anything had changed. She had run his house and his mourning both, and told him what was reasonable and what was not, and he had been grateful for it, because being managed had let him go on not looking. He found now that he could hardly bear the sight of her, and that a good part of the anger was at himself. Silas Corvain arrived at noon. Prot, he came in a good coat with soft, clean, clever hands, a smiling man who bowed exactly as deep as a duke required, and not a hair's breadth more, and who called the laid-out jewels. Charming in a voice like warm oil. He had the easy confidence of a man who had been welcomed in great houses all his life, on the strength of a talent for telling the rich what their treasures were worth. Merrick shook the man's soft hand, and smiled the cold smile he kept for tenants who lied about their rents, and thought, "This is the man." This smiling nothing of a man stood up and swore an innocent man into his grave, and my father let him, and I have seated him at my table and called him welcome. He said none of it. He inquired after the roads. He hoped the rooms would suit. He said the appraisal would begin in the morning in the great hall, with the whole collection, including, he added mildly, as if the thought had only just occurred to him, the old sapphire collar. I have developed a curiosity to hear it valued again. And he saw for just an instant something cold flicker behind Corvain's easy smile before the man recovered himself and bowed, and agreed that of course his grace should have, whatever he wished. That evening, at a long, stiff dinner, Corvain made himself charming, telling polished stories of the great collections he had valued, and Verena beamed on her brother, and Marek sat at the head of his own table and watched the man eat his food and drink his wine and thought that patience was a colder pleasure than he had ever known it to be. Afterward, he sent for Elspeth on a pretext of the nursery and met her instead in his grandmother's rooms, where Honoria sat bolt upright and entirely unsurprised, as though she had arranged the whole turning world and was merely waiting, a little impatiently, for it to catch up with her. He told them both what he had found in the strong room. He set the sealed packet on the table between the three of them, his father's signet dark and unbroken in the wax, and the three of them looked at it as one looks at a thing that will change everything the moment it is touched. "It has not been opened in 2 years," he said. "Whatever is inside it, my father sealed it with his own hand and hid it and never once spoke of it to me, and carried the knowing of it to his grave." He looked at Elspeth and then at his grandmother, and something in him that had been loose and grieving for 3 years drew itself up and turned to iron. "I think I know what it is. I think it is the proof your father sent for safekeeping, and I think it is also the reason no living soul has seen it since, and I would rather learn the worst of my own blood, with witnesses beside me, than alone." He laid his broad hand flat upon it, gently, the way a man lays a hand on something he is about to hurt, whatever it costs. "The name of Caldrith, and I begin to fear it will cost a great deal. I mean to open it now, and I want the two of you to see everything that I see." He broke the seal. Inside the oiled cloth were the drawings. Elspeth knew them before she could breathe. Her father's hand, the fine, sure lines she had watched come out of his pen 100 times as a child, the great collar laid out plate by plate, and beside each stone its weight in water and the very quarry it had come from, and his assay of the gold set down in his careful figures sworn and dated and true. There was even, in the corner of the first sheet, the small private mark he made on work he was proud of, a tiny wren, of all things a joke between them, because he had called her his little brown wren when she was small and grave and always watching. She had taken the name from him without ever telling a soul why. 2 years of grief broke over her at the sight of it. She pressed her fingers to her mouth and made no sound, because sound would have become weeping, and she had promised herself she would not weep in front of these people until she had earned the right. It was all there. Every stone Corvain had sworn was paste. Her father had recorded as true, with the merchant's name and the price he had paid and the day he had bought it. No forger sets down where to find the proof against himself. It was the honest record of an honest man kept the way. Honest men keep records, without any thought that they will one day have to prove they are not thieves, and it turned Corvain's sworn appraisal to ash. But there was a second paper folded beneath the drawings, and this one was not her father's. This was the cramped ducal hand of the ledger. Marek drew it out and read it, and Elspeth watched the color leave his face by degrees, the way water leaves sand. He read it aloud, because he had asked for witnesses, and he was not a man to spare himself. It was a letter his father had written and never sent, perhaps to himself, perhaps to heaven, perhaps to the son who would one day sit where Marek sat. In it, the old Duke sat down, in the flat, exhausted voice of a man, confessing the whole of it. Corvain had come to him privately after the scandal broke, and shown him these very drawings, and told him plainly that the collar was true and Caro honest, and had then asked the Duke a single question, gently, as one reasonable man to another. Did his grace wish it known throughout the county that the great Duke of Caldrith had been so easily gulled, that he had commissioned a treasure, praised it before all his friends, and then, when a whisper started, joined the mob that cried it false and helped to break the one honest man in the affair? Or did his grace prefer that a settled scandal stay quietly settled, a nobody goldsmith stay ruined, these inconvenient papers stay locked away, and Corvain's discretion be guaranteed forever? The old Duke had written that he had told himself the man would land on his feet, that such men always did, that it was not truly his doing. And then, in a different ink as though added on some later sleepless night, I have heard today that Caro is dead in a debtor's cell. I have heard he asked for his daughter at the last. I will find my courage and put this right when the talk has died down. The date beneath it was 3 weeks before his own death. He had run out of talk dying down. He had run out of everything. The room was very quiet when Merrick lowered the page. His father, the man whose portrait hung in every hall, whose name he had spent his whole life trying to deserve, whose good opinion he had gone on courting in his mind for 2 years after the man was in the ground, had known that an innocent man was being destroyed and had weighed that man's whole life against his own dignity and had found his own dignity the heavier. He had let a coward's silence do a murderer's work, and now the proof of it lay on the table in Merrick's own hand, and there were, he understood, only 2 roads out of the room. To clear Ambrose Caro was to hang that truth in the open air forever, where the whole county, his tenants, his equals, his daughter's children someday, could read exactly what the 9th Duke of Caldroth had been beneath the portraits and the honors. And there was the other road, and both of them knew it, and neither of them named it for a long moment. The packet could go back into the fire. The drawings could vanish, as they had vanished once before. His father's name could stay clean, his house untroubled, his own inheritance of honor unspoiled, and no one living but the 3 of them would ever know it had been a lie. Merrick sat with the letter in his hands for a long time. Elspeth did not press him. She had lived 2 years for this exact moment, and she found she could not, would not, buy her father's name at the price of forcing this one, because a vindication one had to beg for was only another kind of charity, and she was done being given things. She would let him choose freely, and she would abide by the choosing, whatever it cost her. He folded the letter at last, with great care, and Elspeth saw what the choice cost him, and loved him a little for the fact that it cost him anything at all, that he did not reach the honest answer easily, the way a shallow man would, but had to climb to it over the body of everything he had wanted his father to be. "My grandfather built this house on a word he kept," he said quietly. "My father broke his in this room to spare himself. I will not spend the rest of my life as the 3rd man in that story, the one who knew and burned it." He looked up and his eyes were wet and steady. "Tomorrow, in front of Corvain, in front of my aunt, in front of every soul I can crowd into that hall, we are going to open this again, and this time it will not be a duke's private shame. It will be the truth, and your father will have it back." The appraisal was set for the morning. The great hall of Caldroth had not held so many people since the ball, and the mood beneath the chatter was strange and taut, for word had gone about that the Duke himself had summoned the household to watch a valuing of jewels, which no one could remember a Duke ever caring to do. The collection lay on green baize down the length of the long table. Lady Verena presided at her brother's side, gracious and glittering. Silas Corvain turned his loop in his soft fingers, and worked through the plate and the rings with his warm, murmuring patter. Charming, a fair stone, some little value here, writing his figures in a neat book, entirely at his ease. Elspeth stood among the servants at the back, in her gray gown, her hands folded, unnoticed. It had been agreed. She was to be no one until the Duke made her someone. At last, Corvain came to the collar. It was brought out on its own cushion, the great rope of gold and sapphire, dull with 2 years of neglect, and a little murmur went round the hall because everyone knew its story, the famous fake, the goldsmith's shame. Corvain barely troubled to raise his loop. "Ah," he said with a small sorrowful smile for the room. "The unhappy collar. I examined it once before, your grace, in circumstances I regret. Paste and washed gold, I fear. A sad piece of trickery. Of no account." He set down his pencil. "As I recorded at the time." "As you recorded at the time," Merrick repeated. He rose from his chair. I should like it examined once more by someone else." Corvain's smile did not move, but something behind it did. Lady Verina's fan paused. "Your Grace," she said lightly, "my brother is the finest eye and by someone else," said the Duke. And he looked down the length of the hall, past the gentry, past the upper servants to the gray figure at the back. "Miss Caro, if you would." The name went through the hall like a cold draught. Heads turned. Somewhere, a teacup found its saucer with a small betraying clatter. Elspeth walked the whole length of that room with her spine straight, and her stained hands loose at her sides, past the gentry who had never once looked at her, past the upper servants who had cut her, past Lady Verina whose face had begun to do something complicated. And she felt every eye in the place and did not care for one of them, because for the first time in 2 years she was walking toward her father's honor instead of away from her own ruin. She took up the collar. Her hands, which had trembled in the study, did not tremble now. She raised the loop, and in the ringing silence she began, in the clear, unhurried voice of the bench, to appraise it, the true blue fire of the stones, Ceylon sapphires each and every one, the weights that answered exactly to the working drawings now unrolled upon the table for all to see. The gold assayed and struck with her father's true mark beneath the tarnish, every single thing that Silas Corvain had sworn on his professional honor was false, proven honest by his own victim's daughter. Aloud, in the light, stone by stone by stone.
"This is not paste,"
she said, and her voice carried to the last corner of the hall. "This is the finest collar made in England in a generation, and the man who called it false knew that it was true when he said it, because he is holding in his own record book on that table figures for these stones that he could only have taken from these very drawings, which he swore under oath he had never seen." She set the loop down beside it. "My father did not cheat the Duke of Caldrith. He was cheated of his name, his living, and his life, by a smaller man who found it cheaper to ruin him than to lose to him. My father's name was Ambrose Caro. He taught me everything I know with these hands you were all so careful not to look at. And he was innocent." Corvain was on his feet, his oil turned to acid, blustering of insolence and impostors and a serving girl's mad lies, of slander of the law, until Merrick laid the old Duke's own confession upon the table beside the drawings and read out, in his flat carrying voice that did not spare his own blood one syllable, precisely what his father had written in this house about the bargain Silas Corvain had offered him. He read the whole of it. He did not stop at the parts that shamed his family, and with every line the hall grew quieter and Corvain grew smaller, until at the end there was no more blustering left in the man. There was only a smiling little fellow, with the smile gone off him like paint off a wall, staring at his own long-ago scheme laid open in a dead Duke's hand, in front of a hall full of witnesses who would carry every word of it to every drawing-room in 3 counties by nightfall. Lady Verina had gone the color of ash. "I did not know," she said, into the terrible quiet, and for once, looking at her face, Elspeth thought it was probably true. "Silas, you told me the girl's father was a common cheat. You told me they were all liars and debtors, the whole family, that she'd come sniffing after money that was never hers." "He lied to you," Merrick said, "as he lied to my father, and as you were more than glad to believe, because it was convenient to believe it, and because the person it hurt was exactly the sort of person you have never troubled yourself to be kind to." He looked at his aunt without any heat at all, which was somehow worse than heat. "You did not have to know the particular lie. Verina, you only had to want the girl gone badly enough not to ask. You have run this house on convenient cruelties for 20 years, and I let you, because it spared me the trouble of looking. That is the end of it." Now he did not have them dragged away. He did not shout. Elspeth, watching, understood that he had weighed his measure of justice as carefully as her father had ever weighed a stone, and that it was the heavier for being cold. Bursty Corvain's false appraisal would go before the Goldsmiths' Guild in the courts, with her father's drawings and a dead Duke's signed confession behind it, and the smiling respectability that was the whole of the man's fortune, would go the way he had sent her father's, his word worth nothing in any house in the kingdom, his living gone, his name a byword. And Verena would leave Caldrith within the week for the small remote property that was hers by right, and had always been beneath her ambitions, to keep her own house at last with no one below her, to punish and to live out her days in precisely the shrunken obscurity she had worked so patiently to inflict on a friendless girl. It was not vengeance. Elspeth found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she did not want vengeance, that the appetite for it had quietly died in her, somewhere between the study and this hall. It was only the scales set true at last, which was a colder and a cleaner thing, and enough. Then Merrick turned from all of them, and crossed the hall to where she stood, and before the whole staring house he took her scarred right hand in both of his, gently, deliberately, the very hand whose torn glove had betrayed her, and bowed over it as though she were the greatest lady in the land. "Welcome to Caldrith, Miss Caro," he said. "I am sorry it took us so long to see you." Summer came to Caldrith, and the house that had been shut against the light for 3 years threw open its windows to it. The reckoning of that day in the great hall traveled exactly as far and as fast as Merrick had known it would. Within a month the Goldsmiths' Guild had struck Silas Corvain from its rolls, and published the reason, and the courts had taken up the drawings in the dead Duke's confession, and a settlement was ordered that made him repay, to the last penny and with interest, everything his lie had stripped from the house of Caro 2 years before. He left the kingdom rather than live in it disgraced. Ambrose Caro's name was restored in the same papers that had once helped to break it, and there were those in the trade, old journeymen, Jory Pell foremost among them, weeping openly when the news reached him, who said it had only ever taken one honest voice raised loud enough at the right moment, and grieved that it had come 2 years too late for the man himself to hear it. It had come in time for his daughter. Sometimes that is all the justice the world will give, and it has to be enough, and it was. Elspeth Caro stayed. There had been talk, of course, when it was learned that the household's plain grace seamstress was a gentleman's daughter with her name restored and her father's honor sung across the kingdom, and a great deal more talk when it became known she was now a woman of independent means as well. She might have gone anywhere. She had a small fortune coming and every right in the world to spend it far from the house where she had carried coals and eaten cold suppers alone. But the Duke had asked her to stay, awkwardly, formally, hiding a great deal behind the safe, dry word curatorship, because Caldrith's collection wanted a scholar's hand to set it right, and whose hand better than the daughter of the man who had made its finest treasure? She had a suite of rooms in the east wing now near the dowagers, and a workroom flooded with north light, and the freedom of a woman who answered to no one. And every day she worked among the beautiful things her father would have loved, cleaning, cataloging, coaxing 2 neglected generations of gold and silver back into the light, and every day the impossible distance between a duke and a goldsmith's daughter wore a little thinner, worn away not by any grand declaration but by 1,000 small, unremarkable hours of being, at last exactly who she was in the same rooms as him. The old sapphire collar hung in the great hall now where everyone who entered would see it, no longer shut away as a shameful fake but displayed like the triumph it was, with a small plain card beneath that gave the maker's name in full. Merrick had insisted on the card. He passed it 12 times a day, and Elspeth suspected he did it on purpose. Audley spoke on a morning in June. She had been Elspeth's shadow all that spring, the two of them and the sharp old dowager forming a small strange court of their own in the east wing. 3 people the great cruel world had underestimated, keeping company and asking nothing of one another. The child's silence had changed over those months without anyone quite marking the day. It had grown warmer somehow, less like a locked door and more like a held breath, the pause of someone gathering herself rather than the emptiness of someone gone away. And then one bright morning in the walled garden, sitting on the warm stone bench and watching Elspeth thread a needle to mend the wing of the blue silk bird for perhaps the 100th time, the little girl reached out and put one small hand flat on Elspeth's wrist to stop it. In a rusty little voice that had not been used in 3 years, and cracked on the very first word. "Don't. I like it broken. It's ours." Elspeth went absolutely still. Every instinct told her not to make a fuss, not to gasp or seize the child or call out, because some things are far too precious to startle, and a thing that has taken 3 years to come back must not be frightened off in its first moment. So she only set the needle down and looked at the small, solemn face turned up to hers and said, as steadily as she could manage with her own throat closing, "Then broken it shall stay. It's ours, and we shall keep it exactly as it is." And Ottilie nodded, deeply satisfied, and leaned her whole small weight against Elspeth's side, and that was all. No more that morning, and no fanfare wanted. But Merrick, coming across the garden to find them, had heard his daughter's voice carry on the still June air from 20 paces off, the first words of his only child in 3 years, and Elspeth looked up over the top of the child's head and saw a grown man stop dead among his own roses, the tears running down without any shame in them at all. She understood then that the last locked door in that whole shut-up house had come quietly open, and that none of them ever again would be quite as alone as they had been. He came to her by the lake that evening, when the day's heat had gone soft, and the light lay gold and long across the water, and the swifts were stitching the air above it. "I have rehearsed this a great many times," he said, "and I am reliably informed by my grandmother that I have made a poor business of everything to do with you from the very first night, so I shall try very hard not to spoil the end of it." He almost smiled. He had learned to again over the spring. "I am a slow man, Elspeth. I was slow to see you when you stood against the wall of my own ballroom, the only true thing in a room full of guilt, and I looked straight past you until my daughter showed me where to look. I was slow to trust you and slower still to understand that all the warmth that has crept back into this cold house these last months came in quietly through the sewing room door, in the person of a woman everyone had agreed to overlook. I will not be slow now." He took a breath and the practiced speech left him, and what remained was plainer and truer. "I reached for your hand once to fill an empty place. In a dance, I did not even want to dance, and I found the whole truth of you hidden in a torn glove, and it has been undoing me by slow degrees ever since. Stay, not as a curator, and not as a guest, and not because this house owes you a debt, though heaven knows it does. Stay, because I love you, and because I have been half a man for 3 years, and a whole one only since you came, and because I would like to spend whatever years I am given learning to deserve the hand you very nearly hid from me forever. Marry me, Elspeth. Have a mended, foolish, grieving man who took a scandalously long time to know his own heart." Elspeth looked at him, the cold, upright, honorable man who had chosen a dead friend's justice over his own father's good name, and she felt the last of the weight she had carried since a debtor's cell lift clean away. She did not answer in words. She had spent 2 years hiding her hands, turning them from the light, ashamed of the marks a good man's teaching had left on them. Now she drew off her glove, bare, scarred, stained, a maker's hand and a daughter's hand, and entirely her own, and she laid it open and unhidden in his. "There," she said and smiled up at him. "No more torn gloves. Nothing to hide, and no one left to hide it from. You may have the whole of the truth, Your Grace. It was always yours to see, if you had only looked." He closed his hand over hers, over the scars and all, and this time neither